The hum of the airport filled the air, voices overlapping, luggage wheels clattering across polished floors, the occasional announcement echoing over the intercom. Amid the chaos, a man stood in the first-class line, calm and composed, as if the world around him moved in slow motion. He wasn't in a tailored suit. No designer shoes. No expensive watch flashing under the bright airport lights. Instead, he wore a simple plaid shirt, faded jeans, and a pair of worn-out boots that looked like they had traveled more miles than most of the passengers combined. A backpack slung over his shoulder, scuffed, well-used, the kind that carried stories no one had heard. He didn't stand out, yet something about him was different. A few people stole curious glances, but no one said anything. They didn't recognize him, at least, not yet. Victor Harding, on the other hand, noticed him immediately. And he didn't like what he saw. Dressed in a sleek, tailored suit, polished leather shoes, and a wristwatch worth more than most people's monthly salaries, Victor exuded confidence, the kind that demanded recognition. He tapped his fingers impatiently against his carry-on, eyes scanning the line with a look of mild irritation. And then, his gaze landed on him. The man in the plaid shirt. Victor smirked. First class. He scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. Didn't think they let just anyone in here these days, he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. The man turned his head slightly, meeting Victor's gaze with quiet amusement. His eyes held no anger, no reaction to the insult, just an unreadable calm. Yeah, he said, his voice smooth, unbothered. The world's full of surprises. Victor frowned. He'd expected embarrassment, maybe an awkward chuckle. Instead, he got nothing. For some reason, that irritated him more than he cared to admit. The line began to move, and the first-class passengers stepped forward one by one. Victor straightened his jacket, flashing a self-assured smile as he handed his ticket to the flight attendant. His confidence barely wavered, until he glanced to his side and saw the man in the plaid shirt doing the same. Victor's smirk faltered. He wasn't just here for a mistake. He wasn't lost. He wasn't being escorted out. He was boarding. The thought gnawed at Victor as they walked through the jet bridge, entering the luxurious cabin where spacious leather seats gleamed under the soft cabin lights. A flight attendant greeted them warmly, offering refreshments and hot towels, the epitome of exclusivity. This was his world. A world of status, luxury, and careful curation. And yet, here was this guy, casual, relaxed, completely out of place but somehow unfazed. Victor settled into his seat, adjusting his cufflinks, but his momentary satisfaction was shattered the second he looked up. The man in the plaid shirt was lowering himself into the seat right next to him. Victor stiffened. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, glancing at his ticket again as if hoping it had all been a mistake. The man gave a small, polite smile. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said, voice smooth, effortless. Victor exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to relax. He wasn't going to let some random nobody ruin his flight. Instead, he turned slightly toward his new seatmate, assessing him again, his curiosity now laced with skepticism. "So," Victor started, his tone casual but edged with something sharper. "What do you do?" The man was adjusting his backpack, tucking it under the seat in front of him. He looked up, as if the question hadn't surprised him in the slightest. "I work in film." Victor arched a brow, lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Film, huh?" He let the word hang in the air, watching for a reaction. "Let me guess, small productions. Indie stuff?" The man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Something like that." Victor chuckled, shaking his head as he reclined slightly in his seat. "That's interesting. Always find it funny how people try to carve out their space, you know. But let's be honest, some spaces aren't meant for everyone. First class, for instance." The man didn't react. Not in the way Victor wanted him to, at least. Instead, he simply glanced toward the window, taking in the city lights below as the plane prepared for takeoff. There was no visible irritation, no attempt to defend himself. Victor leaned in slightly, intrigued now. "I mean, no offense," he added, voice smooth, almost friendly. "You just don't seem like the type." The man finally turned back toward him, his expression unreadable. "The type?" Victor gestured vaguely, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "Come on. You know what I mean." There was a pause. Just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then, finally, the man spoke. "I think we all have our place," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "And sometimes, it's exactly where we are." Victor narrowed his eyes. He wasn't sure why, but something about that answer unsettled him. The plane ascended smoothly, the hum of the engine settling into a low, steady vibration. Victor shifted in his seat, glancing sideways at his travel companion. Something about the man's presence irked him, not because he was loud, not because he was intrusive, but because he was composed. Unbothered. As if nothing Victor said could touch him. And that? That was irritating. A flight attendant made her way down the aisle, offering drinks. Victor barely waited for her to finish speaking before flashing a confident smile. "Champagne, please. Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." The flight attendant nodded politely and turned to the man beside him. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, please." Victor scoffed, shaking his head slightly. "Water?" he repeated, almost laughing. "You're flying first class, my friend. You might as well enjoy it." The man accepted the bottle from the flight attendant, twisting the cap open with ease. "I'm enjoying it just fine." Victor chuckled, swirling his champagne in its glass, watching as bubbles drifted lazily to the surface. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone's meant to enjoy the best life has to offer." The man took a slow sip of his water before setting the bottle down. "Maybe the best is different for everyone." Victor narrowed his eyes. This guy had a way of answering without answering, turning every conversation into something vague and philosophical. It annoyed him. He wasn't about to let it go. "Or maybe people say that when they've never actually had access to what really matters," Victor said smoothly, leaning back into his seat. The flight attendant moved through first class, checking on other passengers, but Victor could see her glance in their direction. Others were noticing, too, subtle, stolen glances from a few rows ahead, hushed murmurs just quiet enough to be ignored. But the man beside him? He remained still. Calm. Almost too calm. Victor wasn't done yet. "You know what's funny?" he continued, tilting his glass toward the light. "Life's a lot like flying first class. You work hard, you earn your place, and you enjoy the privileges that come with it. But some people," he gave a pointed glance toward the man's worn-out boots, "some people are just here because they got lucky." The man finally turned, facing Victor fully now. His expression hadn't changed much, but his eyes? They held something new. Not anger. Not irritation. Just, a quiet patience. "Luck or hard work," he said slowly, "we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" The words hung in the air, pressing against Victor in a way he didn't expect. Around them, a few passengers exchanged knowing glances. Someone let out a soft chuckle, not mocking, but amused, as if they were enjoying watching Victor stumble over his own arrogance. Victor smirked, lifting his glass in a mock toast. "That's nice. Almost poetic. But real life isn't that simple." The man didn't respond. Not immediately. He simply turned back toward the window, as if the conversation wasn't worth his energy anymore. And that? That infuriated Victor more than anything else. Victor clenched his jaw, rolling his champagne glass between his fingers as the plane cruised smoothly through the sky. The conversation wasn't going the way he'd intended. He had expected some flustered response, some awkward attempt at justification. But this guy, whoever he was unreadable. It was infuriating. He wasn't done yet. You know, Victor mused, tapping the rim of his glass, people who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever noticed that? The man beside him didn't even flinch. Instead, he turned slightly, his eyes steady, measuring. I've noticed that the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside, he said, his voice even, quiet, but with an unmistakable weight to it. Victor stilled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But something about the way he said it, the effortless certainty behind those words, landed like a punch to the ribs. A few rows ahead, someone let out a breath of amusement. Others shifted, exchanging glances. The atmosphere had changed. Victor forced out a chuckle, though it felt forced even to him. That's cute. Real deep. But the world doesn't work that way. You don't get a seat in first class by sitting around and hoping people respect you for being humble. You take it. The man exhaled softly, as if this conversation were a predictable cycle he had no interest in entertaining anymore. The real world is made by people, Victor, he said finally, and in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything we own. Victor stiffened. The way the man said his name, calm, controlled, sent an unexplainable shiver down his spine. Something shifted. The flight attendant returned, collecting empty glasses, her movements efficient and professional. But as she reached their row, her eyes flickered toward the man in the plaid shirt, and a warm, knowing smile crossed her face. Mr. Reeves, she said politely, the captain wanted to let you know your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards. Silence. Complete, deafening silence. Victor didn't move. Didn't blink. His mind tripped over itself, trying to process what he had just heard. Reeves. The name hung in the air like a lightning strike. A few rows ahead, someone gasped softly. Others sat up straighter, their eyes darting toward the man in the plaid shirt, suddenly seeing him differently. Keanu. Keanu Reeves. Victor's throat went dry. His heartbeat thudded against his ribs as his mind replayed every single word he had said since they'd met. Keanu, meanwhile, simply nodded at the flight attendant, offering a polite, effortless smile. Thank you. Victor swallowed hard, heat creeping up his neck. He looked around, suddenly aware of the way people were staring at him, some with amusement, some with quiet disapproval. He had spent the entire flight condescending to Keanu Reeves. His stomach twisted. His voice failed him. His fingers gripped the armrest as he scrambled for something, anything, to say. Keanu turned toward him, expression as calm as ever. Something wrong, Victor? Victor's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. His voice barely came out. You didn't say who you were. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. I didn't think it was necessary. Victor felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. The weight of his own arrogance, his own assumptions, came crashing down on him in full force. Desperately, he tried to claw his way out. Look, I didn't know. Keanu sighed softly, shaking his head. Victor, he said, voice steady, almost kind, the truth of what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. Victor sucked in a sharp breath. It was over. And he had lost. Victor sat frozen, staring ahead but seeing nothing. His fingers twitched against the armrest, his carefully curated confidence unraveling with every second of silence that followed Keanu's words. The truth doesn't change just because you now know my name. The words echoed in his mind, pressing down on him with a weight he hadn't expected. Around them, the hum of the cabin felt distant, almost muffled. The people who had once ignored their conversation were now openly watching, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet amusement. Victor could feel their judgment, the shift in perception. He had been the man in control, the one setting the tone, dictating the narrative. Now, he was exposed, laid bare in the most humiliating way possible. He swallowed hard, glancing at Keanu, who had already turned back toward the window, utterly at ease. No gloating. No smugness. No need to rub it in. Just quiet, unshakable confidence. For the first time in a long time, Victor felt small. A slow breath left his lips, shaky, uneven. The urge to defend himself, to throw out some last attempt at regaining the upper hand, burned in his chest. But what was left to say? That he hadn't known. That he wouldn't have spoken that way if he had. That was exactly the point, wasn't it? He had judged a man based on nothing more than his clothes, his demeanor, the way he carried himself. And now that he knew the truth, it didn't erase the words that had come out of his mouth. It didn't change the way he had behaved. Shame clawed at his insides. A long moment passed before he finally found his voice. It was quieter this time. Smaller. I need to apologize, he muttered, staring at the seat in front of him. He forced himself to look at Keanu, his throat dry. Not because you're you, but because I was an arrogant ass. I treated you like you didn't belong. And that's on me. Keanu turned to him, his expression unreadable for a beat. Then, slowly, he nodded. I appreciate that. Victor exhaled. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath. He expected that to be the end of it, that Keanu would let it go, that they'd sit in silence for the rest of the flight, him stewing in his own humiliation. But then Keanu spoke again, and his words landed even heavier. Sometimes, he said, the thing we spend our lives chasing is the very thing we don't have inside ourselves. Victor's jaw tightened. The words stung, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they were true. Keanu leaned back, closing his eyes as if the conversation was over, as if it was just another moment in a long list of moments that didn't rattle him. But for Victor, the turbulence had only just begun. He sat in silence for the remainder of the flight, the weight of the exchange pressing down on him harder than any judgment from the passengers around them. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about status, about control, about proving something to the world. He was thinking about who he was, and whether that was someone he even liked. The plane touched down, the cabin filling with the sounds of movement, seatbelts unclicking, bags being retrieved, passengers standing and stretching. Victor remained seated as Keanu stood, effortlessly slipping his backpack over his shoulder. Victor watched as a handful of passengers, ones who had stayed quiet during the exchange, approached Keanu with hushed admiration. A polite smile, a nod of thanks, a few soft-spoken words of appreciation. Keanu greeted each of them with patience, kindness, never once acting as if he were above them. The realization struck Victor like a fist to the ribs. This was what real status looked like. Not wealth. Not arrogance. Not control. Respect. Earned, not demanded. Keanu turned to leave, but before he disappeared into the terminal, he glanced back at Victor, his expression unreadable, but maybe, just maybe, there was something in his eyes that looked a little like understanding. Victor swallowed hard, gripping the armrest, his world feeling strangely different. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he was. And for the first time in his life, he thought maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing.